Hello, class, and welcome to week 6 of Nonviolence and Peace Action, where we're going to look at peace in the age of extremism and terrorism. As you know by now, you are due to do a screencast assignment, so please get that ready before listening to the screencast. What I'd like you to do is right now read these two articles that you see. One is by Abu Farha. It's called Dying to Live, and it's in the making of a human bomb, an ethnography of Palestinian resistance. You will find this article in the files section in Canvas for this course and choose week 6. You can download the article from there. I also want you to read this article, Is One Man's Terrorist Another Man's Freedom Fighter? And answer these questions. Question 1. According to Abu Farha, why do people choose to be suicide bombers? Be sure to include the page number from where you found the answer. And question 2. Describe Raqib's life. How did he become a suicide bomber? What happened to his family after the suicide? And question 4. Friedersdorf explains how there is a push to remove the MEK from the terrorist list. Read the article. What are your thoughts on this push? Those are the 3 questions. Take a moment now to read these 2 articles. I also want you to answer this question. What is terrorism? Define it. It could be your own definition of terrorism, or you can actually go online and find a definition of terrorism, but be sure to cite it if you've chosen to talk about it from somebody else's point of view. So let's go into what terrorism is. Believe it or not, there is no universal definition. We all have an understanding of what we believe is terrorism, but there is no official definition. One academic, Herman, says terrorism is a tactic, not an enemy. It is also considered a rare occurrence. While acts of terrorism across the globe have increased in recent decades, especially in the last 6 or 7 years, in most parts of the world, it's a rare event and is instead focused on particular countries or regions of instability. Also, terrorism is not new. It's been around for centuries. For example, Guy Fawkes. Guy Fawkes was a terrorist in the United Kingdom. He was trying to establish the Catholic monarchy as in England, and he failed at it. That's why there's Guy Fawkes Day, where there's fireworks and they wear his face, but he's considered a terrorist. Okay. Meanwhile, the reign of terror during the French Revolution is an example of state terrorism. So Guy Fawkes represents group terrorism, and the reign of terror during the French Revolution represents state terrorism. Terrorist groups make calculated decisions to engage in terrorism. It's a rational act. And political behavior resulting from the deliberate choice of a basically, like I said, rational actor. Terrorism is a logical choice when the power ratio of government to challenger is high. So what are the goals of terrorism? The goals are, in the long run, political change, revolution, nationalists fighting an occupying force, minority separatist movements. In the short run, it's a recognition or attention to advertise their cause. Terrorist goal would be to disrupt or discredit the process of government. It would also be to influence public attitudes, create fear or sympathy, and to provoke a counter-reaction to legitimize their grievances against the government. So, as we mentioned, the history of terrorism, it's been around for a long time. So let's go into its history. So there is a man named William Lewis. He wrote an article called The Human Use of Human Beings. And he talks about different events of terrorism since the 19th century. One of the things that terrorists used back in the 1860s was dynamite. It was a weaponry considered powerful to terrorists. So it was used, dynamite was used to kill Alexander II by a terrorist. It was used to blow up trains and train platforms. in order to create terror and to give rise to their attention to grievances. In World War II, terrorism takes on a different hue. Japan launches 3,000 human bombs known as the Tokotai, and the Japanese kamikaze are suicide bombers that would die by just like taking their planes during the battles and just hitting buildings or hitting other planes to blow up. After World War II, terrorism is used in anti-colonial movements. Why? So this is right after World War II, so it's a little different than after 9/11. Okay, it's to generate publicity for the cause. So we see the rise of global newspapers and the rise of radio, newsreels during movies. So they're getting their message out by acts of terror in order to influence global policy. And at first, it's successful, which we're going to see in the Battle of Algiers in just a moment. It mobilized sympathy and outside support. And so terrorism was seen as an effective means of transforming local conflicts into international issues. This changes, though, with 9/11. The attacks of 9/11 mark a turning point in world history and the beginning of what we call the War on Terror, which we are still in the War on Terror. The attacks are estimated to have killed 3,000 people. This was the attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center, and it was marked as the deadliest terrorist incident in human history. And as a result, we get the War on Terror, which led to the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 and the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So terrorism pre-9/11 was concentrated in Latin America and Asia, in Africa, in post-colonial countries, or in colonial countries actually, to gain some kind of independence and to air grievances. But this shifts to the Middle East post 9/11. So I want you to take a moment to read this paragraph about the independence Algerian War for Independence. Algeria is a country in Africa, and it was colonized by the French. So just take a moment to read this. You can pause the screencast. So the French weren't innocent people. They truly exploited the Algerians. You can see here during their war, which claimed 1.5 million Algerian lives, French forces cracked down on independence fighters in their then colony, which was ruled by Paris for 130 years. The French military tortured hundreds of thousands of people. During the war, the government censored newspapers, which is the French government, books and films that claimed it had used torture. And after the war, the atrocities committed by its troops remained a taboo subject in French society. So the French were not innocent whatsoever when it came to the way they subjugated the people of Algeria. They exploited them, they tortured them, they stole their resources. So what I want you to do is I want you to watch these two clips. This is from the movie called The Battle for Algiers, or The Battle of Algiers. It's got two slides here that you can see, okay? So you're going to watch both slides. And after you watch both of them, I want you to answer the following questions, okay? So question 5 is this. Knowing the brutal French tactics of the colonial era, would you consider what these people are doing in the clips terrorism? Question 5. Knowing the brutal French tactics of the colonial era, would you consider what they did as terrorism? Question 6. What would be a just way to fight the French? So if you don't agree with this, or you do agree with this, what do you see as a just way to fight the French during the battle for independence? And question 7. How does one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter apply here? How does one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter apply here? Justify your answer. So I want you to take a look here, some statistics that I put in here from our world in data. You can see there is a marked increase from terrorism in the 1970s all the way up into the 2010s. So you can see that there is quite a peak of terrorist acts in the 2010s. You can also see the increase in fatalities for the world into the 2010s. If you look at the United States, it's remained relatively flat, although there should be some kind of rise there because there has been terrorist attacks in the United States. So take a moment to look at the slide here. Okay, and you can see here in 2016 where terrorist attacks have happened. So take a moment to look. Okay. If you are looking at this global death toll of different causes, though, despite the intense media focus on terrorist activities around the world, the numbers of people actually killed by terrorist attacks has pretty much remained low. Terrorists only killed 13,000 in 2010, which is a relatively low number when compared with other types of violent death, namely armed conflict and interpersonal violence. So take a look at the numbers here of who's dying of what. So here's our connection to human security. We focus a lot of time and energy on terrorism. So our state governments, right? The government of the United States, the government of Europe, the government of France spends a lot of time on terrorism. And yet this is what's killing people. One second, I'm going to close the window. Sorry about that. So keep that in mind when we're looking at peace building as we go throughout the semester. Let's look a little bit more about the international versus domestic terrorism. In the case of domestic terrorism here, we are talking about groups of people who have declared themselves as a terrorist group or a group of freedom fighters. So what is international terrorism? The United States government defines international terrorism as premeditated acts of political violence perpetrated by clandestine subnational groups against non-combatants and involves the citizens or territory of more than one country. The definition excludes acts of terror perpetrated by states, like we saw the reign of terror in France. Okay. The State Department divides terrorist attacks into two categories, significant and non-significant attacks. So serious loss of life and over $10,000 in damage is considered significant. Anything less than that is considered non-significant. So why does international terrorism matter? The attacks of September 11, 2001 led to the most radical shift in Western security policy since the end of the Cold War. The war on terror provided part of the rationale for two major conventional wars, both in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the anti-terror campaign has been associated with an extraordinarily high level of anti-Western sentiment in much of the Muslim world. So because of the United States interference in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the insistence of policy changes in some of the countries in the Middle East, we see a rise of resentment in those countries. The number of significant international terrorist attacks appears to have increased dramatically since 2004, as we saw on one of our charts. The war on terror has major implications for human security. So we'll talk about that more. Think about the money, the resources that are being diverted to terrorism causes, like to combating it, versus human security causes. And international terrorism is a human security issue for for poor countries as well as the rich. But here's something that is very startling, and this comes from the U.S. State Department, which is quoted by them. We lack metrics to know if we are winning the war on terror. There are also indirect effects of terrorism. So far more people can die from indirect consequences of major terrorist attacks than from the attacks themselves. So for example, after 9/11, there was an economic slowdown, which led to the deaths of tens of thousands of children under the age of 5 in developing countries. And another example would be there was an attack on a Sudan pharmacy plant by the U.S. because they're suspected of housing terrorists. And that led to a scarcity of medical supplies, causing thousands of deaths in Sudan. So these are the indirect consequences of international terrorism. Okay, so what is domestic terrorism? Okay, this is not lone wolf terrorism. We're going to talk about that in just a moment, but rather terrorism by groups of people. Okay, domestic terrorism is far more deadly. This is on a global scale, not necessarily the United States. More people die from domestic terrorism than from international terrorism. This would be your suicide bombers, okay, and other terroristic acts. They normally take place during civil wars or intrastate conflicts, and they're most likely to be found in large countries rather than small countries, and more often than in democracies than in authoritarian states. So democracy is to terrorism what oxygen is to life. The very freedoms that characterize democratic states facilitates terrorism. Yet no terrorist organization has ever come close to overthrowing a democratic state. So what I want you to do is I want you to go to this article that you see here. U.S. law falls short in confronting domestic terrorism, former Department of Justice officials say. I forgot to put the QR code on there. My apologies. Okay, so you may have to actually type that out. Okay, so I would like you to read this article and answer question 8. So here is question 8. Okay, so after reading this article, question 8 is, should lone wolf terrorism be labeled terrorism or something else? Explain. So think about the tenets of international and domestic terrorism. Should lone wolf terrorism be labeled terrorism or something else? Explain. So one of the things that the article highlights, I think, here is that there's a problem of framing issues in the United States, how we frame terrorism. So with that in mind, let's talk about how terrorism is framed in the United States and how it's framed in Europe and the strategies used to combat it. Okay, so in Europe, terrorism is a police matter. In the United States, it's a military matter. One of the strategies that we use to fight terrorism comes back to all the way back to George W. Bush back in 2001. He says we have to fight them there, meaning in Afghanistan and Iraq, in the Middle East. So we don't have to fight them here. So they fight global terrorism by going to a territory like Iraq. So it's a global war on terror. Fight it over there. So we send thousands of troops. We try to restructure society. We try to force them to take on democracy as their way of governance. Okay? In Europe sees terrorism as a criminal act, and it uses courts and the police, community activism, and engagement to combat terrorism. Okay? So their strategy also would include surveillance and intelligence. Okay? So the U.S. and Europe's approach to terrorism is very different. Another strategy that the United States uses to combat terrorism is to link terrorism and immigration. So the U.S. response after 9/11 was to focus on immigration reform. even though 9/11 bombers were not immigrants. They were foreigners. The security threat is not from immigrants. In U.S. history, every wave of immigration has been associated with some kind of criminality. So we have linked terrorism and immigrants. So this is a problem for the United States. Okay. So I bring this back to the lone wolf terrorist. Do you think, because of question 8, that perhaps a lone wolf terrorist, who is somebody who goes on their own and shoots up a group of people, would be considered a terrorist, or is there a way that we should frame it differently? So think about that for question 8, which you just answered, and if you want to add to it, go back to it. I think this is a great article here. It's called Muslims Are Not Terrorists, A Factual Look at Terrorism and Islam. One of the problems we have in the country, in the United States, is this focus on Islamophobia. Because most of the country is Christian, we create this us versus them, right? The identitarism, we problematize. We go through these phases of identitarism to make this us versus them dynamic. So take a moment to read this article, and I would like you to answer question 9 and question 10. So question 9 is, according to the article, what is the percentage of non-Muslims who commit acts of terrorism on U.S. soil? Question 9, what is the percentage of non-Muslims who commit acts of terrorism on U.S. soil? And question 10, what does the author suggest as a way to combat terrorism? Question 10, what does the author suggest as a way to combat terrorism? Okay. All right. And what I'd like you to do now is the final part of the screencast. And I would like you to watch the video that's coming out of PBS NewsHour. Okay. And while you're watching the video, I'd like you to answer question 11 and question 12. Question 11 is, explain Benjamin's view of why Europe has a problem with Islamic State terrorism. Explain Benjamin's view why Europe has a problem with or of Islamic State terrorism. Okay? And question 12, what would you do or what would you recommend to combat Islamic terrorism in Europe? What would you recommend to combat Islamic State terrorism in Europe? What would you recommend to combat Islamic State terrorism in Europe? The reason I'm asking you all these questions is because this is a way to promote peace. And when we get together for our short group or small group discussion, we are going to discuss the tactics that you suggest that would promote peace. Take care.